identifying partisan voters. The convention would hire its own staff, including its own administrative staff, its own experts. It would be able to do that. There's an estimate that a convention like this might cost, it's likely to cost more than $40 million. So now I'll turn to why advocates want a convention. And the first is structural reform. There are a variety of ideas for changing how the government of Michigan works, and these are an especially good kind of reform to initiate through the convention rather than through amendments, because they rework how decisions based on how all kinds of governmental decisions get made rather than a particular single issue that comes out one way or the other. So some of the structural reform ideas would be to move to a unicameral legislature, meaning to have just one house in the legislature instead of the House and Senate, which would obviously save at least some money on the legislature. Another idea would be to consolidate local government and to work out different rules about how local municipalities get their power for better efficiency or more centralized authority. Some local governments themselves have argued that they need more flexibility in financing, and there could be changes to the constitutional restrictions on how local governments do their taxation and financing. As Professor Sedler mentioned, one possibility would be that those opposed to electing judges could use the Constitutional Convention as a way to put in a different system of selecting judges, such as a merit selection system, for example, where a panel selects who's qualified and then the governor would nominate and the legislature confirm from that list. There could be changes to the initiative and referendum procedures here in Michigan, either to alter them, to make them easier, or to make them harder, or to abolish them altogether. And there could be changes to the term limits on legislators, which some people have also favored. Some of the other reasons that advocates want a convention, but I would suggest could be more easily accommodated by an amendment rather than changing the whole Constitution, would be reopening some of the controversial debates that have been recently put into the Constitution, including things like the ban on affirmative action, same-sex marriage, stem cell research, and education rights. The Constitutional Convention would provoke new discussion on those questions. There are also some obsolete provisions in the Michigan Constitution that don't have effect because the federal law is supreme. So when provisions of the Michigan Constitution conflict with holdings of the federal Supreme Court or the federal constitutional laws, then those Michigan provisions don't take effect. And there are a few of those that have become invalid since they were passed. They're not doing anybody any harm, but they're a little bit messy in the Constitution. Now I'd like to suggest some arguments why opponents to the convention will vote no. And one is what I call the Pandora's box problem. It's the idea that once you start the convention, you don't have a lot of control over what it comes up with. And the last chance for that kind of control by the people will come from the vote to ratify what the convention produces or not. But as I mentioned, it's the convention itself that will decide how much to divide up the work. So the voters might be faced with some parts of a document that they really like and some parts that are less attractive and have to choose to vote yes or no on the whole thing. But once that box is opened, there's no limits on what the convention delegates can discuss or come up with. And if you're concerned about that problem, it might enhance your concern to think that the delegates are likely to be more partisan than regular legislators because of the way that the election system comes in the off cycle. Other opponents say that the problems with Michigan government today are the people in it, not the structure itself, that the political problems won't be solved by structural reform, and that's an argument that you have to weigh for yourself, of course. The expense is one argument not to have it. I think if you favor structural reform of the Michigan Constitution, then it would be imprudent to save $40 million and then lose an efficient government for the next 16 years. But those who don't think that the convention would produce a big gain in efficiency are turned off by the $40 million price tag. And it's likely to exceed $40 million. There's also a certain amount of uncertainty and instability that will persist as long as the convention is in progress. The question of what will they come up with, will we have a lieutenant governor, will we have a unicameral legislature or not, what will they do to bonding and financing and taxation, all of that being discussed by the convention will make those who depend on reliable, stable sources of law and government uncomfortable while they try to figure out what the convention is likely to do. That might have certain economic effects. They might not be that severe, but they might show up. And then, of course, there are some of those same single-issue kinds of changes that people don't want a convention to change. So if you're satisfied with some of the single-topic kinds of issues in the Michigan Constitution right now, including the ones I mentioned, then you might oppose the convention because if you would then risk that those provisions would be changed. And that's similar to the idea that there are a good number of changes that can be made through ordinary amendments to the Michigan Constitution. An ordinary amendment can be proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and of the Senate and then goes to a ballot for ratification. Or it can be put on the ballot by petition by 10% of the voters in the last gubernatorial election, the voters for governor, I should say. So those kinds of amendments, that process itself could be changed in a constitutional convention, how amendments get added to the Constitution. But that process does exist now and has permitted amendments in the recent past, suggesting that it's not all that difficult politically to get it done that way. And now I'll conclude my part before we get to questions with a little bit of a discussion of sort of the political side of things rather than the legal side. Just for your edification, 3 other states are with Michigan considering the same kind of question. There are 14 states overall in the country that have this required question going to the ballot of shall there be a constitutional convention, and Maryland, Iowa, and Montana this fall will also be voting as we are on that question.